So I'm Ali Grady, co-founder and director of the Thrive team, a talent acquisition and people development company. And at our core, we believe that when people feel psychologically safe, included, and valued, they don't just survive, they thrive. So, through our expert search and selection, coaching and training, we help individuals and organizations build resilience, foster connections, and thrive both personally and professionally. So, thank you for joining us today for today's session, Menopause at Work, what employers need to know before the law changes. And menopause is becoming an ever more important topic in the workplace for the reasons that we're going to get into later in the session. And as somebody who was forced into early menopause at 15 years ago at the age of 42 due to living with endometriosis for many years, I'm really pleased that the Employment Rights Act is raising the profile of menopause in the workplace. So I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Hiron, the Hironator, employment law specialist. Richard, if you want to say a few words about yourself now, that'd be good.
Of course. Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. So, yes, I do have a particular moniker, the Hironator, but I am an employment law solicitor. Just a bit of background on me. Really, I started off doing employment law, made a sideways move into HR, moved back into employment law. And now what I do is I focus on helping businesses and individuals to avoid the employment tribunal, because I think, as Ali has indicated, we're getting a lot more employment tribunal cases coming through, partly because of what is coming in through the Employment Rights Act, but also through literally things like company culture. So if you can get the culture right, if you can get how you treat employees right, you're going to end up with a lot less tribunal claims.
So thanks, Richard. Thank you. And thanks so much for joining us today and for all the preparation I know you've done. So we hope that you're going to get involved in the session in whatever way you feel comfortable to you. And please do ask questions as we go along. We'll do our best to pick those up. If you want to get involved, then you can sort of get involved by using the reactions button, or if you want to drop a question into the chat. As I said, the webinar is being recorded and a recording will be made available to you after the event. And we're also going to be sharing some resources that can help you be a supportive employer for those transitioning menopause as well. So look out for a follow-up email. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to look at what perimenopause and menopause means in a workplace context, but really important, it's about preparing for that exposure to any legal risk that there might be, that you might have. So we're going to look at those changes under the Employment Rights Act and what's coming our way. We'll have a look at what reasonable steps and reasonable adjustments really look like in practice, and prepare now so that you can avoid those legal risks, as we've said. We're going to be packing a lot into the webinar as usual, but we do want you to get involved. And I'm going to ask you straight away to just drop into the chat one word that you think about when you think about menopause at work. What word might you associate with menopause at work? If you could drop that into the chat. Right. Brain fog, yeah, challenging, brain fog, embarrassment, reasonable adjustments, brain fog, lots of brain fog coming up, yeah. And embarrassment coming up a couple of times, unsupported, being hot flushes. Yeah, these are all sort of typical words that we might associate with the menopause, not just in the workplace, of course, although that is our focus today. So, I think it's great that we are starting to have these conversations in the workplace, a long time coming. And, we're going to be focusing on how perhaps the impact of some of those words that you said, the hot flushes, those physical changes, the embarrassment, the brain fog, really can impact in the workplace. And as employers, what can you be doing to sort of mitigate and to support individuals? We know that there's a general lack of awareness about menopause. I'd say just in general, my own knowledge before going through it was pretty much hot flushes. I didn't have any understanding of the significance of those physical and those psychological symptoms had. It just wasn't being talked about. Certainly when I was a younger woman. And, I'm pleased to say that that is much less so now. So what do we mean when we talk about the menopause? Well, very simply, it's a natural process, a biological process that's linked to changes in a woman's reproductive hormones. And just a note, when I talk about women on this session, what I actually mean is anybody that has periods and that is transitioning or may transition through the menopause. So let's just have a quick look at this slide. You can see we've got the pre-menopause stage. That would be the time when we would recognize women having periods, regular or not, depending on their cycle. And then, as you can see over the various stages, those hormones levels start to change. So if we look at the first stage of menopause, then that would be known as perimenopause, probably a term most people are familiar with. And during this first stage, that's when the reproductive hormones are changing. Menstrual cycle can become irregular, and you could have symptoms of menopause, but your periods haven't stopped. So then we reach the actual sort of stage of menopause, the average age of that being 51. And this is the time when the woman's body stops producing the hormones that can cause ovulation and menstrual periods. So, and they stop due to lower hormones. Usually affects women between the ages of 45 and 55, but it can happen earlier. Women of colour tend to go through menopause in their late 40s, with factors such as stress through perhaps from racism contributing to that earlier transition. So menopause is defined as 12 months after your last period. So you won't know it's your last period until 12 months has elapsed. So if you haven't had a period for 11 months and then you have a period, the clock starts counting again. So it's really important that you continue to use contraception during that time. Menopause affects anyone that has periods, and it can happen naturally or for reasons such as surgery to remove your ovaries or your uterus. Cancer treatment can also force somebody into menopause, and sometimes the reason is unknown. There are lots of symptoms associated with menopause, and we'll look at a slide around that very shortly. It's important to recognize the significant impact that this can have on individuals. So premature menopause can happen, is defined as sort of before the age of 40, can affect between 1% and 3% of women, and that might be because of premature ovarian insufficiency or premature ovarian failure, or, as I've said, perhaps some medical treatments like cancer treatment. And then the third stage is around post-menopause, and that begins 12 months after the last period, and the woman will no longer be ovulating. And I think important to recognize that because we're all living longer, that people can spend between 30 and 50 years in this period of their life. And it's not to say that they won't be without symptoms either. Every woman's experience of menopause will be unique and different to them. So I think it's important to recognize that when you have conversations with individuals, that even if it's something that you've experienced yourself, it's highly unlikely to be the same experience. So I've talked a lot about who we might sort of automatically think is affected by the menopause, but just have a reflection for yourself at the moment. Who does the menopause affect directly and indirectly? And if you want to drop any answers into the chat, then please do. But basically, directly is going to be women. As I've already mentioned, it will also include people who are transgender, whose gender is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth, intersex people who have differences in sex development and who don't conform to typical definitions of male or female bodies, and then people whose gender is neither male nor female, and who identify as non-binary. People who have physical difficulties or disabilities may experience additional challenges whilst going through the menopause, and people who are neurodiverse may also experience new challenges or feel that their current challenges relating to perhaps to sensory sensitivities, executive functioning, or emotional regulation may be intensified during that period of transitioning through the menopause. And so then indirectly, we've got perhaps everyone else you might be able to think of. That's family, friends, partners, managers, team members, and ultimately the organization as a whole. So even though you may not be experiencing menopause yourself, it's highly likely that you will know somebody that is, even if it's not obvious to you. So let's have a think about some of those symptoms. I know a few symptoms came up in the chat around sort of hot flushes, feeling hot, feeling embarrassed, but there's a whole range of very common menopause symptoms that you can see on the screen. But if you think about those impacting in the workplace, hot flushes, those sudden increases in temperature, how easy is it for the individual to regulate their temperature in the workplace? If somebody needs to wear a uniform, is that uniform sort of menopause friendly in a way? Again, not just hot flushes, but chills as well. How is the temperature controlled environmentally? Is that easy for the individual to have some control over that? Or is it the air conditioning's on and it stays on and it can't be changed for anyone? If you think about those sleep disturbances, then that's really going to impact an individual at work. We all know what it's like to not have enough sleep. I'm sure that's the same for most of us. So, that's going to impact on people's productivity, their ability to be able to think straight, their energy levels, and ultimately that's going to impact on the work that they're producing. And then there are some less common symptoms, and I can assure you, I've had all of these, I think. So perhaps they're not so uncommon, but perhaps they're not the ones that necessarily appear on the sort of lists of symptoms that you see in various places. So, again, all of those symptoms, if you're a person experiencing them, they are going to have a significant impact on your life. And there was a report called Menopause in the Workplace by the Fawcett Society that said almost half of women approached hadn't ha, almost half of women that had responded to their survey hadn't approached their GP, and 3 in 10 have seen delays in diagnosis. So a lot of the symptoms that you see are, you could put it down to other things. It's perhaps not when you think about the bigger picture. Do you maybe recognize that you're in that perimenopause state? And only 4 in 10 women were offered HRT in a timely fashion. Important to note that HRT isn't the only treatment, and it's certainly not for everyone, but for those that might want it, it can be a challenge. So I guess, what can we do in the workplace? Well, making people aware of the symptoms and supporting them to access information, supporting them to attend GP appointments if necessary is also helpful. So some of those common menopause treatments, well, I've mentioned HRT, that helps to balance out the hormones, which can then obviously help the symptoms that the individual is feeling. Talking therapies can also help. That includes CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps somebody to address those sort of their emotional well-being, maybe rethink their thinking. So if somebody is experiencing a hot flush and feels really embarrassed about their brain fog, then CBT can help them to reframe that thinking. And then, some of the things that we can all do without the help of a professional are some of those lifestyle changes and natural remedies. So, eating a good, healthy, balanced diet, exercise, cutting back on stimulants like caffeine, alcohol, smoking can also help to relieve symptoms, along with those relaxation techniques, yoga, Pilates, those sorts of things. But for everybody, it will be different, and it's working out what is right for them. So let's move on to just think about sort of the business case and other cases around why it's important to support people transitioning menopause at work before we get into some of the legalities. Well, women over 50 are the fastest growing demographic in the workplace. So we're going to see more and more people transitioning menopause in the workplace. And, it's not that long ago that women were stopping work, at childbearing age, and they'd have children and they've stopped working, probably only needing to go back 50 years for that to be what was happening. We're living longer, we're working longer, so that means there's going to be more people going through menopause in the workplace. Menopause related presenteeism costs the UK economy 22.4 million, so that doesn't even include the absenteeism. And then in terms of that social responsibility case, we know from research that 1 in 10 women leave work due to the menopause. And I was almost one of those women. It wasn't that long ago that it was only 3 or 4 years ago that I had a conversation with my husband and business partner that I was going to give up work because actually the brain fog was so significant, the anxiety was so significant that actually I was struggling to function. And then the legal case, I'm going to explore a lot more of this very, very soon, but we know that tribunal claims are on the rise, and I'm sure Richard will mention that shortly. So, there are reasons why we should be supporting people through menopause transition above and beyond the legal case, which we're going to come to. It is around, it's good for reputation and your brand, can sort of future proof you as an employer. Also know from research that businesses, companies that have menopause policies and are sort of very vocal about that, they have greater attraction and retention of new staff as well. So, and it also, of course, supports an inclusive culture alongside the moral case. There's also the legal case. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now to talk us through some of the really important points that are coming our way and that we need to be really mindful of.
Thank you,
Richard.
Ali. Thank you very much. So, I guess the purpose of this slide as an introduction is that this is the law as it currently stands. So, as a little bit of context, the Labour government has said that it's looking into creating a particular, what we call protected characteristic of menopause discrimination. So, something specifically focused on the menopause, which is fantastic. We just have to wait until we get there. And this is what we have to work with in the meantime. At present, if someone is experiencing negative treatment because they have the menopause, they have to thread it through one of the first three types of discrimination. So, age, sex, or disability discrimination. And sometimes that can be quite a high hurdle for them to do. So I will take you through each one of these bullet points on this slide, just to give you a brief synopsis and where I can an example. So with age discrimination, this is where someone is being treated less favorably or suffering a disadvantage because of their age. Now, a very good case example of this in a successful age discrimination claim linked to the menopause was a situation where there was a lady at work who was experiencing the menopause, and she was essentially called a menopausal woman and a dinosaur. So I'm sure you can see that one is pretty much the sort of the most obvious example of a successful age discrimination claim. But the key thing is, even though it's age discrimination, you have to link it back to the menopause to bring that element in. So you say, for example, in that particular case, that someone said that this person was a dinosaur. Well, that would be age discrimination, but it doesn't link back into the menopause. So the fact that they called her a menopausal woman, whether or not she was actually menopausal, is what linked it into that particular kind of discrimination. Um, we've discussed a few sort of reasonable adjustments, but there's one thing in relation to age that I just want to highlight here. So, in making reasonable adjustments for someone or a group of people who are going through the menopause, it's also important to consider the people who are not going through the menopause as well. So, let's say, for example, that you have a workplace that is largely comprised of women. Let's say that you have some who are menopausal, some who are likely to be menopausal, and you have some who are nowhere near that kind of age range. So, if one of your solutions is, okay, we're going to lower the temperature in the entire office for everybody, then that could potentially be a disadvantage to those in the younger generation because they might think, great, now we're freezing cold because they're trying to accommodate people with the menopause. So it's finding a very kind of unique solution to those kinds of situations. I have a few suggestions that I will mention when we come to adjustments and reasonable adjustments, but I just wanted to mention that there at that stage because it's also relevant to age. We're then moving on to sex discrimination. So, this is one of the more popular ways of raising a menopause related discrimination claim, naturally because of gender. So, again, that is someone being treated less favorably or suffering a disadvantage because of their gender. However, it's slightly more complicated than that because we have to bear in mind discrimination by perception. And this is where gender and fluidity comes into it a lot more. So, say, for example, that you have a trans man, so someone who was registered female at birth, and they are going through the menopause, but people believe perhaps that they are a man by birth, then that person can be discriminated against on the basis of they are actually going through the menopause. People don't know that they're going through it, but they say cruel things, unwanted things related to that, that really crosses that boundary into negative treatment of I'm actually going through the menopause. You're treating me negatively because you think, for example, that it's just the flu, you're saying negative things. It's that kind of situation. Similarly, trans man, a trans woman can literally be in a similar situation. So they are male, registered male at birth. They're not actually going through menopause, but they are treated negatively because someone perceives that they're going through the menopause because, as far as they're concerned, this person is a woman. We also have to bear in mind a woman who is not actually going through the menopause, but is experiencing symptoms that are like the menopause. So she might be called a menopausal woman, but she's not actually going through the menopause. It's somebody perceiving that she is. So arguably, this is probably one of the most complex ways that a sex discrimination claim linked to menopause can present itself because there are so many different things to consider about it. We then have disability discrimination. Now, this is, again, less favorable treatment or suffering a disadvantage for a physical or mental condition that lasts for a significant period of time and also has a significant impact on the person's day to day ability to do normal day to day things. So we're not just talking about stuff that happens in the workplace, we're talking about simple everyday things. So going out and doing the shopping, meeting with friends, sleeping well at night, having a social life. We're looking at their entire life, not just in the workplace. So I wanted to share one particular example in relation to disability discrimination that is, I think, quite divisive, but illustrates it very well. So there is one particular case where there was a bus driver who was experiencing so many elements of the menopause. So hot flushes, difficulty in her concentration, difficulty sleeping. It was very intense. When you read the case, she had so many symptoms. So clearly it affected her life, not just her work. But the difficulty with the case itself was her symptoms lasted for 3 months and then they stopped. Now, unfortunately, under the law, that is not considered to be long term. So, in that particular case, she didn't have a disability discrimination claim because it had not lasted for a significant period of time. And a significant period of time is usually 12 months or more. So I would expect that to be something that menopause discrimination in the pipeline would address, because I can imagine that's a very divisive, very uncomfortable decision for people who are actually going through the menopause. And that brings us on quite nicely to this point here that we have about adjustments and reasonable adjustments. So I know in the chat earlier there was a mention of reasonable adjustments. So a disabled person is legally entitled to reasonable adjustments, but a person who is not considered to be disabled is not. That is not to say that businesses should not consider making adjustments. It is very important in terms of managing the relationship, keeping the relationship positive, and engendering trust, to consider literally the situation where someone needs support at a very difficult time in their life. And therefore, an adjustment would arguably be appropriate because it helps to make their life and their job easier. When they cross over into reasonable adjustments is if they are likely to be disabled or if they actually are disabled. Now, to figure out what kind of reasonable adjustments you would need in that situation, you don't just need legal advice, HR advice, you also need medical advice because, as Ali correctly said earlier, this is so linked to the person. There is no one size fits all solution. But I thought I'd share some things that I've seen going right, I think, in the workplace. So, to avoid the cliche of talking about desk fans, because we all know about that possibility, there was one particular workplace that I was involved with where they had a really nice setup that I think would work very well for somebody going through the menopause. So what they did, they had one of these offices where you could individually control the temperature in separate rooms. So what they did was they set up a room where someone experiencing the menopause could go and work and they could control the temperature to make it cooler or to make it warmer if they wanted. But it was a very nice tailored way of providing that solution and also ensured that the other employees that weren't experiencing the menopause weren't affected by it. Another solution that you might wish to consider is disciplinary policies. If somebody is unwell, if they are appearing late to work through no fault of their own, or they're having to go early a lot of the time, then you might want to think, let's have some flexibility in terms of the processes that we follow. Because if we are disciplining this person for something that they have no control over, then that itself will probably be an act of disability discrimination. That then feeds us on to these last 2 points of harassment and victimization. So, in dealing with harassment, I'm going to take you through not only the law as it stands at the moment, but how it's going to be changing from October. So, harassment is where somebody is subjected to unwanted treatment linked to one of these first three types of discrimination. So they might be humiliated, they might be offended, they might find it completely uncomfortable in terms of what is happening. So I want to give you another case law example because it's the easiest way to explain this. Let's say that there is a woman working on the shop floor. She is asked by her manager, what's it like to go through the menopause? Explain it to all of us in front of colleagues or customers or both. Um, that could easily be very degrading treatment because literally they are being called out in front of everybody. Similarly, if you're in a situation where someone is meaning perfectly well, if they're saying, please explain to me how this feels, if that is unwanted attention to the worker or the employee on the receiving end going through the menopause, then that's possibly going to be harassment as well. Because if they've said, no, I don't want to share this, I don't feel comfortable talking about it, then bearing in mind that there has to be a reasonableness aspect to all of this, um, If they have said, no, I don't want to discuss this, I find this really uncomfortable, please stop doing this, then that's going to be the harassment aspect as well. Just to pick up on that point about reasonableness that I mentioned, and this also applies to reasonable adjustments. Essentially, the solution that is found in these kinds of situations, or the approach that the worker or the employee is taking, has to be kind of working on both sides of the relationship. So, in terms of reasonable adjustments, if changing something for one employee would bankrupt the business, that's very unlikely to be a reasonable adjustment. Likewise, in terms of harassment, if the person is saying, no, I don't want to discuss this, but you've done everything you can to make it a comfortable situation for them to tell you safely and confidentially, then it's arguable that it would not be reasonable for them to feel that they're being harassed. So, just off the back of that, I just want to leap on to what is happening under the Employment Rights Act in October this year. So, first off, employers will have to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, menopause, naturally, that's linked to gender. That could easily become a sexual harassment claim because it's unwanted attention linked to gender. So, another one in terms of harassment generally is that employers will have to take, again, all reasonable steps to ensure that a third party does not harass its staff. And this does not just apply to women in the workplace, it applies to all workers and employees. Sorry, just a brief pause there. So, um, so in essence, we then come on to what are all reasonable steps. Now, I don't know quite how to address this, but essentially, in October 2026, all of these requirements are coming in. Next year, in 2027, we will receive a definition of what reasonable steps are from the government. I can see a few smiles already, so I won't go into that in too much detail. But I think really in the meantime, the courts are going to decide what a reasonable step is for a business to be following. So it's looking very carefully at what financial impact this will have, what staff impact it will have, and essentially figuring out what you can accommodate and what you can't. And again, to give you an example, this one was from my own personal experience. I was advising a client last week where essentially they were trying to get to a position of accommodating these changes that are coming in. And they said, it's not reasonable for us to actually put a notice on the wall telling people not to harass our staff. And I thought, well, why is that? It's relatively cheap, it's relatively straightforward, you put it in a prominent place. And I'm not convinced that they were really thinking about it in terms of what they could do. So it's very important to sit down, think about what you can do rather than what you can't do. And that is likely to put you in good stead for figuring out essentially whether you have done the best you can, really, to avoid harassment. The last one is victimization. Thank you for bearing with me in terms of all the legal stuff. We're nearly there. So, victimization is where someone has done what is called a protected act, and they are treated negatively for doing that. So, a protected act could be they've raised a grievance for being treated differently or negatively for essentially having the menopause. Or it could be that they've already raised a tribunal claim against that, and the business, for whatever reason, is treating them negatively for having raised that claim. So, it's one to watch out for. Certain things can be perceived as being vengeful, they might not be intended to be vengeful, but just bear in mind very carefully how you're treating employees and workers. It goes without saying who might be experiencing this condition and also raising complaints or concerns. And I think that takes us over onto the next slide.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so we've got a quick poll for you now, and basically it's about the state of readiness that you might feel in your business or organization for the changes that are coming, the menopause-related requirements in the Employment Rights Act. So just a very quick poll there. Let me share those responses. We've got 25% feeling that they're ready, which is excellent. 75% feeling somewhat. And what's really good news, I think, is that nobody is saying no, not at all. So people are on that journey in some way. So thank you very much for giving us that information there. That's helpful to know. So next slide, Richard. I think you're going to talk a few more bits about the Employment Rights Act and what might be round the corner.
Exactly. So we've got, as I mentioned, certain things in the pipeline. So the idea of bringing into force at some point in the future menopause discrimination as its own particular heading for discrimination, which I think will be very welcome. Also quite difficult for them to put together, but also very welcome. Um, we've also got the harassment changes, as I mentioned, but we also have the equality action plans, which are coming into effect essentially at different trigger dates. So on the 6th of April 2026, organizations of any size, if they want to, can submit these equality action plans. So part of it is about gender pay reporting. The other part is about what businesses are doing to address and accommodate menopause in the workplace. Now, as said, that will come in on a voluntary basis from the 6th of April this year. And then from a point to be decided next year, it will become compulsory for all businesses over the size of 250 employees. So a lot of this, we're waiting for information essentially on what details need to be provided, but we do have some hints about regulations to follow. So they will tell employers essentially how they need to submit a report, what format it needs to be in, who in the business needs to review the information before it is submitted, and what information essentially needs to be provided. So we're waiting on that to be provided to us with the 6th of April staging date for the voluntary reports. I would hope that that would be coming in very soon. And then we have certain other things that are coming into play. So we've dealt with the harassment angle, but we're also looking at whistleblowing. So at the moment, it's not explicitly stated under whistleblowing laws that somebody can essentially raise what we call a protected disclosure, where they think that there is sexual harassment occurring or that it might be occurring. The truth is that they can do that, but the law is being changed to make it more explicit and specific from the 6th of April that they can do that. And that would involve reporting at the first stage to their employer if their employer does not do what they hoped their employer would to correct things or doesn't do anything at all, then essentially the employee would report on to the relevant public body, such as the health and safety executive. And then, sorry, I'm just checking my notes because there are so many things coming in. One of the really interesting things that I think, but also quite vague as well, is that on the 6th of April, there is something called menopause guidance coming into play. And we don't know at this point in time precisely what that's going to be. We don't know if it's coming from the government directly or via ACAS or from a third party organization, but it's one to watch out for. So, as said, it's coming in on the 6th of April. I would hope, and this is just me talking, I would hope that it is something that actually gives guidance to employers and businesses generally on how to help, how to guide people, whether it's their staff or staff going through the menopause, on how to work alongside that in the workplace. So yeah, I think just to cover off the slide, we've dealt with a few of the reasonable adjustments that could be put in place. One thing I would say is that you're not just guided by the legal side of things. the medical side of things, bearing in mind the specifics of the employee and what their needs are, is absolutely crucial because the medical advice usually guides the legal and the practical approach. And
Thank
now I think we're moving over to another question for you, Ali.
thank you, Richard. Thanks. That's really helpful. So we've got a question for you, and just really for you to reflect on, perhaps, and to drop into the chat if you're happy to share. What do you offer in your organisation that supports menopause? Um, you've heard some of the things that Richard's mentioned that could be useful, but really, what's already going on in your organization or your business that supports the menopause? Because the chances are you're probably, a good way along the journey of supporting individuals. So I'd love to see what you can share in the chat, what's going on, and um, whilst you're thinking about that, Richard, I know we had a specific question that came in with one of the registrations was, and you may feel that you've sort of answered it sufficiently, but how to best support an employee who's going through the menopause and what job adjustments might they need? I know that will be very specific to the individual's job that we don't necessarily know, but yeah, just is there anything that you might add to what you've already talked about? And we'll
I
pick up on
think,
that.
yeah, I think so. I think first off, kind of inviting the employee or the worker to have a conversation about it. So there is um a business that I work with, not a client of mine, but essentially they were talking to me about this the other day, and they they're very much the I'm thinking of the best way to put it for you. They don't want anyone to be stressed. They don't want anyone to be pressured. They just essentially want people to tell them if they need support.
Right.
So I think that focuses so much on the cultural side of things. It's creating that emotional safety for the
Yeah,
employee or the worker to come to you and say, look, this is happening in my life. I'm very worried about it.
yeah,
What can
yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Richard. And I can see sort of on the chat we've got things like businesses have got mental health advocates. There's a lot of psychological impact or symptoms from the menopause, so that could be really helpful. Online GP service. Menopause policy in place, fans, got a picture of a fan there, menopause champions in place, flexible working, celebrating, promoting awareness on international celebration days, guidance, flexible working, specific menopause network, a Medicash scheme to claim back on private appointments, as well as online GP webinars for the organisation as well. We've got a free resource that people will be able to download, which is a menopause action plan, but is individual for it's for the individual, and that could act as a good framework for a conversation. So you'll be able to download that shortly. We'll still send you details, but so I think you're right. Everything where you can create that sort of psychological safety that people can express their wants and needs is so important, and that starts from the top. I think, really, doesn't it? It's I think it's about having open conversations and letting people know it's okay to talk about the menopause, to talk about their needs as well. I think other things we've mentioned: flexible working, uniform environmental adaptations. We've talked about that sort of cooling and maybe needing to change the heating. And yeah, those sort of peer support networks, those menopause champion networks as well, can be really helpful. Thank you. Sorry,
Sorry, I
go.
think there's one more. And I'm not trying to push anything for anybody. But literally there's training as well. So um th- again, sorry, lawyer brain kicking in here. I'm thinking about a particular example where there was a male dominated workplace where they essentially just dismissed the possibility that a woman in the workplace could have any kind of condition. So for those kinds of workplaces where it is male dominated, but arguably for workplaces generally, to have a training program in place to help understanding, it helps to create allies for those who are going through the menopause.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of led us very nicely on to our next slide, Richard, which is really about how the Thrive team and or Richard can help. You know, from the Thrive team's point of view, you know, exactly what you said there, raising awareness. I think I probably started the session saying that, you know, there still is very little awareness around menopause, even for people that might be experiencing it themselves directly. You know, raising that awareness so that people know actually, yeah, actually, I could get some help with this if I want to. Really important that managers are aware, they know how to have conversations, perhaps they know to look out for signs that somebody might be struggling and feel confident to have that conversation. And also, perhaps for the individual, they might benefit from menopause coaching, you know, helping them to develop some strategies to you know, perhaps overcome that brain fog, overcome that embarrassment, helping them to build their confidence and maybe, you know, advocate for themselves in the workplace. So those are the services that the Thrive team can offer that, you know, and I'm sure there are many other providers as well. But these are the sorts of things that as a business you should be thinking about providing. And Richard, perhaps you'd like to say a little bit more about how you could help.
Oh, so as it says there, I provide legal advice and support. Often I have, as an example of that, clients, for example, a tech company that I have at the moment, they just literally sign up because they don't want to fall into the trap of it being dragged to a tribunal. I mean, at the end of the day, it's very commercial advice as well, but the focus is on let's see what we can do to help you to put you in the best position so that you're not falling foul of some of the obvious or not so obvious tripwires that these kinds of complex issues can appear to put in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ever get, you know, if you ever go through a tribunal process, you know, it's not just the cost in terms of money, but the emotional cost is so significant, isn't it? No matter if there's a winner, there's nobody really a winner in those situations, are there? So always a best to avoid those legal routes if possible. So you know, important to get that early advice, isn't it? And as you've mentioned, you know, throughout, it's that medical advice as well. So referring to your occupational health provider and, you know, getting that specific advice for the individual. So we mentioned that we've got some free resources. There's a QR code that you can scan there, and I would say scan now because we are literally in the process of changing over our website. So our current website is going to disappear almost any moment, and our new one will appear at some point. But if you don't have the opportunity to scan at the moment and want the resources, we will get them to you. So that's fine. But what we're sharing with you is some menopause conversation tips and the wellbeing action plan for menopause, as well as a template if those are useful for you. We've recorded the session. The recording will be sent out to you. And if you've attended live to the session, you'll also get a very comprehensive handout from Richard on some of the employment and legal aspects that we've talked about today as well. So that will also come to you if you've attended live. But we've actually got a couple of minutes. So for any questions, so if anyone's got any questions for Richard or for myself, then it would be great to hear them. I think important to note that we are not medical experts. So if they're medical, then we're probably not asking the right people. But yeah, if there are any questions, either drop them into the chat or if you want to raise your hand, we can sort of you. Everyone's very quiet. Must be lunchtime. Okay. Well, if there are no sort of questions, then you always have the opportunity to drop us an email. Michael, I think you said you had a question. If you want to drop it into the chat or come off mute and ask.
So,
Hi,
Can you hear
Michael.
me? Hi, yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry,
Hi.
just wanted just some clarification, just around, you mentioned at the start, menopause refers to a woman who has periods.
hmm
But then Richard, I went up for the fire alarm, but come back, and you were saying sort of about a trans man. What's the sort of terminology we should be sort of thinking about, when we're sort of saying, you know, is it like a general kind of women who have periods or a person who has periods? What's the sort of, I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's a great question, Michael. Yeah,
I'm
Richard,
happy to field it.
yeah.
So I would say a person, because that way it's capturing so much, but not it's less likely to offend.
Mm.
Or if you wanted to, you could tailor it to the specific individual, but that's going to be very difficult with a very broad policy. So I would say a person.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you.
And Michael, you might have missed it because of your fire alarm, but I did talk about who was directly affected. So if you go back and watch the recording, there's a yeah, there's 1 minute or
Ah,
so in there.
brilliant.
So you'll be able to capture that. And I think we had a question from Linda. Is there a checklist of the action plan to be put in place? Richard, I think that.
So, in terms of the action plan, so in the handout, there is information on what we think at the moment needs to go into an equality action plan. If we're talking more about action plans more generally, then I think it's really having a clear menopause policy in place, and that really should be guiding you through what you need to do in terms of risk assessments and basically understanding your staff and how you can assist them. So there's not going to be a general one, but there will be one that you can create that's quite specific to your workplace.
That's great. Thank you. And Linda said thank you as well. Well, lovely. I think we've probably got time for one more question if anyone has a burning question. But if not, then just want to say thank you so much to Richard for your really calm, measured, practical advice and knowledge sharing there. I think it's been really good to hear that directly from you. And I appreciate it's an ever-changing situation, isn't it? So, there'll be more details to follow. And I think your calm approach is probably very helpful when, we don't have all the information and we're going to have to start reporting on it in the not too distant future. So please do feel free to connect with either myself or Richard, or follow the Thrive team on LinkedIn. And just to remind you all, you will get a copy of the recording in the next few days. So it will come out to you. And yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. And thank you especially to Richard. Thank you. Great.
To Ali for having me.
That's a pleasure.